Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study in the Gospel of Luke. We are trying to finish up chapter 22 today. 71 verses. This is a long one, but I think we can make it if I am quick and concise and don't ramble on and don't leave my notes. Before we jump into the notes, though, I do want to tell you about some upcoming things that we have going on. Once we finish Luke's Gospel, I'm going to go back to making some of the, much more of our variety of videos, including Matthew in 5 minutes, the chapter-by-chapter outlines that can be done in 5 minutes, just like we did in the Gospel of Luke. So those are coming down the pipeline. And also, the book of Acts is already in the works, but I'm really hoping to do Acts differently than some of the other Gospels that we've studied. I'm hoping to make the videos much more visually interesting and stimulating, and doing that through incorporating some artistic work into, well, if you could call my drawings artistic work, incorporating some of that into the study and maybe going at a slower pace, but making the videos much more engaging. At least that's my hope. And in order to do that, I need a lot of time and I need kind of a new skill set. And so I've been working on that, and I'm definitely still working on that. But being here in Europe now and making the transition to my wife and I working for ourselves, it's freed me up to do that. And I've wanted to do it for a long time. It just wasn't possible with the things that we had on our plate. So that's coming. Maybe there'll be a preview of that coming up shortly. But good things to come after we finish the Luke study. All right, let's jump into this. So Jesus has just eaten the Passover with his apostles at the beginning of this chapter, and he's changed the memorial from a remembrance of the Israelites leaving Egypt and their freedom from slavery in Egypt to a memorial of the freedom that his disciples will receive from sin through his body being crucified on the cross and his blood being spilled to affect the new covenant. Judas has been revealed as the betrayer, and Judas has now left and gone off to find his scumbag allies. And Jesus and his apostles are about to leave the upper room. So that's where we're picking up in verse 39. Let's read 39 through 41. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed. Okay, so they're now departing this upper room where they've been eating the Passover. Jesus brought his apostles to the Mount of Olives, and it says that this was his custom, so they must have gone here a lot, and there are other times in the Gospels when we read about them being there. Matthew 26 says that he went specifically to Gethsemane, a garden that was on the mount. Now, the exact location of Gethsemane is known with some certainty. It's still debated a little bit, but if you go to Jerusalem today, you can actually visit what they believe is the ancient Garden of Gethsemane, and there's some ancient olive trees there. My understanding is they don't date back quite to the point of Jesus, but they're pretty old. There's a photo of that garden in your notes. And if, by the way, if you don't have the notes, there are links down in the description. So Jesus took the 11 apostles with him, the 11 because Judas has left, but he chose Peter, James, and John to accompany him a little bit further into the garden, according to Matthew 26:37. He told them to watch and pray to avoid falling into temptation, because the night ahead of them was going to be full of both temptation and fear. So Jesus left these 3 apostles, and he continued on into the garden to pray a little ways, about a stone's throw away from them. And he was very distressed. He was very troubled about what was about to happen, what he was about to endure. At this point, his beatings were only a few hours away, and his crucifixion was only one sleepless night away. Verse 42. I probably should have included this in the last section. It says, "He withdrew from them a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus is praying to God the Father, and he asks God for another way to accomplish what needs to be done, but he submits himself to God's will ultimately. And I think this really puts on display the fact that Jesus was both God and a man, because some of his humanity is certainly on display here. So, of course, he has this divine nature. He had foretold his death. He knew that it was the eternal plan of God. He knew what was coming. But here we see this human nature dreading the physical pain and dreading what it's going to take to actually get this thing accomplished. I think it's really important for us to notice this part of Jesus. I mean, can you imagine if God never knew, well, if God decided to judge humans, but he never experienced how hard it was to be human? If God required things of us, but he never went through the things that we go through. I mean, a lot of gods, or little g gods of other religions, are in that position. But, no one's going to be able to look at the God of Scripture on the day of judgment and say, well, you don't know what it was like to be me. You never went through the things that I went through. How can you, sitting up here in heaven, judge me when I was down on the earth suffering? Right? No one's going to be able to look at God and say that, because God came to the earth and suffered with us to save us. An application here. God definitely encourages us to make our requests known to him. But those requests should always be made with a spirit of humility and a spirit of submission to God's will. And if God chooses not to give us what we request, then we should be confident that in his infinite wisdom, that's greater than ours, his mind is to direct us down a path that's better than the one that we were asking for in the first place. God doesn't refuse his children to give them what they ask for in prayer just because, just out of spite or he likes to torture us. The reason that prayers get answered in the negative is because God knows better than us. And a lot of times we think, think about your own experiences. Have you ever prayed for something and been like, wow, I'm glad it didn't work out that way? Well, yeah, God knows all of those situations. And even when we can't look back on situations and think that we're glad it didn't turn out a particular way, we would be if we knew what God knew. Verse 43 and 44. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. So God heard Jesus' prayer, and an angel was sent to minister to him. We don't exactly know how the angel strengthened him or what happened, but this is similar to what happened in Matthew chapter 4, after Jesus had completed his persecutions in the wilderness. It says that the devil left him, and an angel came and ministered to him. So, similar. Now, as any man would, Jesus agonized over this task that was in front of him. He knew it needed to be done, but that didn't make the details any more appealing. And the text says that the intensity of his agony resulted in sweat like great drops of blood. Now, as far back as I can remember in my time in the church, people have always debated whether or not this was sweat that was just like great drops of blood, or whether his sweat was great drops of blood. Is this just describing maybe big droplets of sweat, or is this talking about Jesus was actually sweating blood? Now, there is a verified medical condition where a person can sweat blood, or it looks that way anyway. It's called hematidrosis. Probably need my wife's medical expertise to pronounce that correctly, but it's a rare condition. And it's thought to affect people that are experiencing like extreme distress or fear, like facing death or torture, or just in agony, or are violently what am I trying to say? Violently distressed somehow, maybe emotionally or physically. I have an interesting story about this, and I don't know if it's exactly the same thing, but so my friend the other day, actually, maybe 2 months ago, he told me this story about how he'd eaten something and he got food poisoning and it made him sick, and he was vomiting in his bathroom. Right? I know, pleasant story, but when you're vomiting, it's quite an intense experience and not a pleasant one, and one that causes you a lot of, muscles tense up and can cause you a lot of stress, especially if you're really sick. And he was doing this, whatever, and he finished, and he looked up in his bathroom mirror, and his face was all red, and his blood vessels under his skin had burst. And so there was blood sitting under his skin. And I don't know if that's the same situation, but in that case, he's violently caught up in basically these intense convulsions, and it causes his blood vessels to burst. Now, he wasn't actually sweating out the blood. I don't know if that would have happened if he had continued, but I thought that was really interesting, because I had never quite heard a story that would match anything even similar to. Well, personally, I'd never heard a story from anyone that I knew that would in any way match this medical condition. But that may have been what it was. Maybe it was something entirely different. I don't know. But I thought I would tell the story. When we think about Jesus' condition here, I don't think that any of us are ever going to be able to fully relate to the extreme distress that Jesus was experiencing. Yes, there are people who have died physically brutal deaths, and they know ahead of time what's coming for them, and that causes them agony. But no one has ever done that while bearing and paying the price for the sins of humanity. And I suspect, I'm almost certain, that there was a spiritual weight to doing that we are never going to understand. No human being is ever going to understand the pressure and the weight of accomplishing the cleansing of the sins of the world and paying the price for those. So, sure, people have died. Other people have been crucified in history, and other people have died terrible deaths, even being tortured and otherwise. But I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to liken the death of a human being to the death of Jesus, because of the spiritual side of things that have to be accounted for. Verse 45 and 46. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray, that you may not enter into temptation." So Jesus walked this stone throws back to Peter, James, and John, and he found them sleeping. Now, they were supposed to be praying, but instead they were sleeping. And Luke includes this interesting detail here that I don't think any of the other writers have. He says that they were sleeping for sorrow. And we aren't told exactly what they were sorrowful about. There's no indication that the apostles felt like they were in any kind of immediate danger. So, I suspect that maybe what was weighing them down was Jesus' sorrow and some of the events that had occurred that night. And maybe they just found it easier to sleep than to, maybe they were mentally exhausted. They were probably physically exhausted. And, let's talk about a few of these things. They probably could have observed Jesus in his agony just a short ways away in the garden. So he's bothered. They didn't understand exactly what his agony was about, but they did care about him, and they did love him. And watching someone that you love suffer and being unable to help them, that can cause a great deal of sorrow for somebody and emotional toil. Their low spirits, I think, also could have been a result of what Jesus had told them during the Passover. He had reiterated these details that they didn't comprehend, that they didn't like, though, about his being arrested and killed. We know from the other Gospels that John, the apostle, he knew that Judas was the betrayer. And it's possible, we don't know, but he may have told the other apostles that, or these other two, Peter and James, he may have told them who the betrayer was. And so their mind is working over that as well. And additionally, Jesus has told Peter that he's going to deny him that night. So, what's that about? So with all of these factors swimming around in their minds, sleep may have just been the best way to escape the worry and the sorrow and the sadness and the emotional stress that they were under. Now, yes, there certainly was a lot weighing on them, but sleep was not the solution, as Jesus made clear. It was a time for prayer, not for sleep. Jesus wanted them to pray for a specific reason, and that was to avoid temptation. And I really think that that's interesting on a number of levels. But when you think about Peter, if you know the story of what's about to happen here at the end of the chapter, would Peter have denied Jesus if he hadn't fallen asleep, if he had prayed instead? Would that have been one of the temptations that he could have avoided? And you may say, Jesus already predicted it. But did Jesus already predict it based on the fact that he knew that Peter would fall asleep instead of pray to escape temptation? We don't know, right? It's kind of mind-boggling to think about, but we don't know. It's hard to say. But apparently, there were some temptations that the apostles... There were some temptations that the apostles could avoid having to deal with if they stayed up and prayed. Right? The specifics of that were not told, but evidently there was something. Prayer would have made prayer would have made things easier on them in the future had they done it versus not doing it. And that got me wondering, I wonder about us. Is that true for us? I think it is. Would we accomplish great things through the power of God or avoid detrimental pitfalls in our lives if we prioritize prayer over sleep, but really just prioritize prayer in general? Jesus' words lead us to believe that we would. There would be temptations that we would never meet if we stayed up to pray. And even though the plans of Judas and the plans of the high priests and the elders, that they were kind of already in motion at this point, Jesus still suggests that the apostles' prayers could have changed certain variables in the way that the events of the future were going to play out. And I've heard some people say or suggest that prayer is kind of worthless once the wheels of circumstance are in motion. But these verses would definitely suggest otherwise. There's definitely a lesson here about God's foreknowledge. Jesus knew and could announce ahead of time the ultimate end of any given situation. He knows the choices that everyone's going to make in every situation from now until eternity. But he still leaves us choices. And there's no indication that those choices are an illusion. Here, Jesus told the apostles to stay awake and pray. Jesus told them that their prayers could affect spiritual affairs. And when Jesus found them sleeping, he didn't say, oh, I know I told you to stay awake, but you didn't really have any choice in the matter anyway. You were sovereignly made to fall asleep. You didn't have any, it wasn't up to you anyway. It was going to play out the way I decided anyway. Yeah. Like, that was just I told you that, but you couldn't have done it anyway. That's not what Jesus says to them. It's not an illusion. God puts very real choices in front of us, and he expects us to make the right decisions. And our choices affect the future and affect the spiritual world, affects what God does. Evidently, it can affect what Satan can do. So prayer is very powerful, and we really need to prioritize it. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm not as good at prioritizing prayer as I need to be. Here we see Jesus telling the apostles to prioritize prayer over sleep. I'm not very good at that. I like to sleep. When I'm tired, I want to go to bed. And yet, again and again and again, the precedent of Jesus' ministry is that he prioritizes prayer over sleep. How many times does he go out in the middle of the night or go out very early in the morning to pray? It must be important, and we need to treat it that way. So all that being said, yes, our prayers change things. Yes, our prayers affect the physical and the spiritual realm. But at the same time, God knows all of the choices that human beings will make. He knows whether we will choose to pray or not to pray, and he weaves his will through all of those choices. And the crucifixion is really, case in point of that. And the more you study it, I think the more you see it. All right, verses 47 and 48. While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. And he drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? So if you remember, the Jewish authorities, they were afraid to do anything to Jesus because of during the daylight hours, because of the crowds. And they were afraid of upsetting the crowds or causing a riot or causing issues with the Romans and unrest. It was not going to go well for them if they caused a stir. So Judas led this crowd full of angry, shamed, cowardly people, namely the chief priests and the elders and a bunch of other hooligans, and Judas led them to Jesus. Matthew tells us that they brought swords and clubs to this midnight gathering. And before we discuss that further, I think there's a good application here that we can learn from Judas. We shouldn't underestimate the power of addiction and lust and greed. Judas had watched Jesus humiliate, and I mean humiliate, just read the last couple chapters, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and the Pharisees and the Sadducees again and again and again. But when they waved a little bag of money in front of his face, all of a sudden he was ready to turn his back on Jesus and go lead this mob of losers to arrest the Lord. And what can we learn from that? Well, I think we can learn that if we allow anger and greed and lust and addiction to control us, then we are going to start acting as irrationally as Judas. I mean, how stupid is it that he sides with these guys who Jesus has just crushed in public debate again and again? And yet he does. Why? Because he has this love of earthly things. And they pull his attention away from the beauties and the superiority of Christ, and they draw it off in just completely irrational directions. And if you think that we are, or if you think that you are immune from that, or that doesn't affect you, or you could never be a Judas, think again, because I think we all have the potential to be as irrational as Judas when we allow these things to grip our hearts and our minds. So anyway, we've talked about this a little bit already, but why did the chief priests and the elders need Judas to betray Jesus? Well, there's the part that we just mentioned. They needed someone to reveal Jesus' location to them so that they could arrest Jesus during the night, when not a lot of people were around, to avoid causing a stir. You think about it, Jesus was going to eat the Passover in this upper room. The chief priests and the elders, they didn't know where Jesus was going to eat the Passover. It's not like he had a residence, because he's in Jerusalem and he's from Galilee. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. So they don't exactly know where he's going to be. And they need an inside man to locate the Lord. So Judas guides them. And this was actually prophesied. It's mentioned by, I believe it's Peter. It's Peter. In Acts chapter 1, verse 16, he says, "Brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke beforehand by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who has become a guide to those who arrested Jesus." So Jesus' betrayal had been prophesied. Judas is now filling that role, and he's acting as a guide to these, to Jesus' enemies, to help them arrest him under the cover of night, so they can do it without a riot. You think about maybe some other reasons why they wanted to do this. This is, I suppose, speculation, but some other things to think about. Maybe they wanted Judas really to insult Jesus. They, when your enemies come and get you, that's one thing. But if your friend comes and gets you, when your friend betrays you, that stings on a deeper level. And it would have been a slap in the face to be betrayed by a friend, and to have for the chief priests and the elders to kind of steal Jesus's guy and use him against him. So maybe they wanted to do it for that reason. Maybe they wanted to do it because Judas could have been a convenient scapegoat for them. Maybe they factored that in. If they had been asked after Jesus' arrest, they could have denied, and they said, "Oh no, we weren't the ones who came and wanted Jesus arrested. We weren't the ones who went and got him. His own disciple, he led us to Jesus because he told us that Jesus was speaking against Judaism and against the state. So if you have a problem, go take it up with his own follower." Maybe they wanted to use Judas in that way as well. Whatever the reasons, in a scene that's very familiar to Christians and non-Christians alike, Judas comes up and greets Jesus with a kiss. And that's probably going to sound really weird to a lot of modern audiences, specifically those of us who have grown up in the United States and in a lot of places in the world. But actually kissing somebody on the cheek, even men kissing each other on the cheek, is not unheard of even in the world today. I don't know if they still do it in the Middle East, but so I currently live in Albania, in Europe, and have seen this actually, where they will kind of kiss each other like on the side of the face or on the cheek. It's I know they do it in France. You always see that in the movies, but they actually do it here as well. So it's not anything strange. There is that verse in I think it's Romans 16:16, where it says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss," right? That greeting of friends is what it's talking about. Verse 49 through 51. "And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, 'Lord, shall we strike with the sword?' And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said, 'No more of this.' And he touched his ear and he healed him." So the apostles, they realize what's happening here. And they see this crowd that's come to arrest Jesus and take him away. And some of them were ready to fight, even though they were probably outnumbered. Now, Peter, being Peter, he doesn't wait for the Lord to respond. In a moment, he's drawn his sword and he's lopped off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And John's gospel tells us that this man's name was Malchus and that it was his right ear that was cut off. But in a move that probably surprised the apostles, Jesus told Peter to put his sword away because, this was not the time for that. And he then proceeded to heal Malchus's ear. He puts his ear back on, which I'm sure Malchus was grateful for. And he makes it abundantly clear to the apostles, and I think specifically to Peter with his little sword, that his military might is not what's going to cause this mission to succeed, and it's not what Jesus needs. Jesus says that if he wanted to, he could have replaced his 12 apostles with 12 legions of angels. Matthew chapter 26, verse 52. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" A legion, if I remember correctly, is anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 in the Roman military. So let's see, 12 times 5. Let's see how bad my math is here. What is that, 70,000? So Jesus is saying, look, Peter, your sword isn't gonna win this war. If I needed military might, I would have it in an instant. And that's not what we're doing here. Peter and the other apostles, they seem to think that this was their chance to fight for the kingdom of heaven. This is the moment that they had been waiting for. And as much as they misunderstood, we've got to give them credit for their courage, I think. A lot of times we look at these scenes and we kind of look down on the apostles because they're so confused. But even being confused, they were brave. And they were apparently ready to stand here and fight to the death to make this, to bring about the expectations of their imagination. But they were mistaken. Jesus' kingdom wasn't going to be won that way. And they were going to have to learn that lesson. It was going to be a hard lesson to learn. But a side note here, and this is something I came across in my studies that I hadn't thought about before. John's gospel is actually the only gospel that reveals that it was Peter who was the one who did the ear lopping. John tells us that it was Peter, but the other gospels just mention that it was like one of the apostles. And some people think that is because basically to cover Peter's identity, not to incriminate him in any way, because the other three gospels were probably written before Peter died, and John's gospel was probably written after Peter died. So, for John to reveal that it was Peter, it's not a big deal because he's gone at this point. He can't be criminally charged or hunted down for this coming to light. But potentially he could have been if it had been written in any of the other gospels. So I don't know if that's true. I don't think we can say one way or another, but I thought it was an interesting fact. Now, if I had written this story, this is where Jesus basically fills the role of the epic adventure hero, and he whips out his superpowers, and he takes all these fools to school in this mob. That's the hero that the world expects, and that we've been trained to expect. Those are the heroes that we idolize. But Jesus wasn't that hero. Jesus is our hero because he didn't call the 12 legions of angels. Jesus is our hero because he didn't use the superpowers, even though I believe it's also John's gospel that when there's a moment when the crowd surrounds Jesus, and he makes a statement, and I think he confirms his identity to this crowd. And it says that the crowd fell back. Like there was some kind of like force that pushed the people who had come to arrest Jesus. It pushed them backwards. I can't remember if it's John's gospel. I think it's John's gospel. But anyway, Jesus shows that he has this power. But Jesus is not our hero because he uses superpowers and miraculous power to destroy his enemies and to fight for what's right. Jesus is our hero because he doesn't. Jesus is our hero because he doesn't execute judgment on those who disrespect and undervalue him. Jesus is our hero because we are the mob. And he sacrificed himself to the mob so that they would have a chance to be forgiven one day of what they were doing. Application. We don't see Jesus running away or lying about who he is, saying, "Oh no, you got the wrong guy, go look over there." He patiently just waited and prepared himself through prayer to accomplish God's work. Now, he could have run, I suppose, spared himself the discomfort and the agony of the cross, but if he had done that, then the world would never have any hope of salvation. We wouldn't. Now, do you remember Jonah in the Old Testament? There's a whole book named after him that describes what we know about him, the book of Jonah. It's one of those small ones in the back of the Old Testament, but Jonah was a little bit different than Jesus. He tried to run away from what God wanted him to do. He didn't want to go preach to the Assyrians over there in Nineveh. He didn't want to preach to them because he didn't want them to repent because they were evil. He wanted them to be punished instead. So he attempts to run away from the mission that God gave him. Jesus, though, in contrast, loved evil people, loved sinners. And his love kept him from running away from the mission that God gave him. So we ask ourselves in application, are we Jonah or are we Jesus? Do we not really care if the world is saved, like Jonah? Or do we really want everybody to be saved, like Jesus? We can definitely save ourselves some discomfort, maybe even some agony, if we don't really care about other people's souls. But if we really want to see the lost saved, then we're going to have to face some discomfort to accomplish what God's called us to do in the mission. And Jesus has already told us this up front. Christian avoidance of discomfort is detrimental to the church's growth and to the spread of the gospel. And unfortunately for many Christians, and I'm one of them many times, for many Christians, our faith ends where our comfort zone ends. We're willing to serve God up to a point, but then we start to feel uncomfortable and we say, yeah, that's not my talent. That's not my gift. I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. What if that was Jesus' mentality? Yeah, I'll do this thing until I start to feel uncomfortable about it, till it starts to cause me personal distress and harm. Well, we wouldn't have a savior, would we? So be Jesus instead of Jonah, even though it's harder to be Jesus. Verse 52 and 53. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and to the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out against me?" Let me try that again. "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." Jesus is going to permit himself to be arrested. But before that happens, he rebuked those who came to arrest him. He had been out in public in Jerusalem, in the middle of the most public areas in Jerusalem, for days, without any kind of protection, without any kind of, security guards or whatever. He was just out in public, Why did they wait until the middle of the night? Jesus asked them that. And of course he knew the answer. They were weaklings who feared the people, who feared, their actions were based on what other people thought about them. And they wanted to hide their actions in the dark. And he just calls out their cowardice right to their face. I mean, how ridiculous is it for these men who pretended to be so strong and authoritative to bring this army under the cover of darkness to arrest an unarmed man who had never threatened them in any way other than threaten their pride. So Jesus told them, "This is your hour and the power of darkness. Nighttime in the dark is when the wicked do their work." And the chief priests and the officers had come out in the dark to do the dark work of Satan. 54 and 55. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Jesus was arrested, and he was taken to the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. The high priest was the leader of the priestly class of Jews under the Old Testament law. Aaron, Moses' brother, had been the very first high priest of the Jews. And if you've read any of the other Gospels, maybe you've come across kind of an interesting fact, and that is that there are actually two people called the high priest during Jesus' arrest and his trial. There's a guy named Annas, and there's a guy named Caiaphas. And some people who aren't super familiar with the history of the first century will say that the Bible contradicts itself here, because Jesus is taken to both of these men during his trial. And they'll say, they couldn't even keep straight who the high priest was, because there was only supposed to be one. But to understand why that isn't a contradiction and why it's just a historical, why it makes perfect sense when you understand the history behind it, we have to understand a little bit more about Annas and Caiaphas. So Caiaphas, well, we should start with Annas, I suppose. In 6 AD, this guy named Annas was appointed the high priest. He was appointed by the Romans because this was a political appointment. The whole position had been corrupted, and it was just a mess, and so it was a political appointment. So the Romans appointed Annas the high priest in 6 AD, but they got kind of tired of him, and they removed him from office in 15 AD. And in his place, a little bit of nepotism here, but in his place they appointed his son-in-law, who was Caiaphas. So these two guys who are mentioned here during Jesus' trial, one's the father-in-law and one is the son-in-law. And although Annas had been removed, it's thought that he was really still the guy who the Jews viewed as being the high priest. He was pulling all the strings in the background. So while Caiaphas officially with the Romans held the title of high priest, it was really still his father-in-law, Annas, who the Jews looked to for the important stuff. So when we understand that, we understand why both of these men kind of carry the title of the high priest. To the Romans, Caiaphas was the high priest. To the Jews, Annas was still the high priest. Verse 54 tells us that Jesus is taken away to, it just says the high priest there. I'm pretty sure he gets taken to Annas first. Why can't I remember that? I'm pretty sure that's right. He gets taken to Annas first. Now I'm going to have to look it up. Hold on. Get out my e-sword. I don't know why I don't just have it in the notes. Holding, please. Please hold. Your call is valuable to us. Please listen to this terrible elevator music while we wait for this Bible program to boot up. Let's see. Annas. Search, go. Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, yeah, so John 18 says, first they led him to Annas, and then they led him to Caiaphas. Okay, so in verse 54, he goes to Annas' house, as I suspected. Okay, now where was I? Okay, Jesus is taken to Annas' house, and Peter tails the crowd, and he doesn't go into Annas' house, but he goes into the courtyard around his house. The other Gospels tell us that all the other apostles except one fled in fear, but Peter is still there. He's following the Lord. You can imagine how confused he must be at this point. All this time, he's had in his mind that he's preparing himself to fight for the kingdom of God, and that he's never going to let Jesus be arrested and killed. And then when the hour of his expectation came, when it was time for him to stand up, Jesus told him that his efforts weren't needed. Nonetheless, as confused as he may be, I think, again, we ought to admire Peter for his courage in following Jesus to the courtyard. He wants to be close to him. He doesn't know what's going on, but he knows he wants to be close to Jesus. Now, unfortunately, his courage is about to fail him, but I think that his failure should be seen in light of the courage that is displayed first. Don't pick out somebody's flaws without recognizing the good that they've done and the battle that they've been fighting that maybe have led up to those flaws. Because all of that needs to be taken into account with Peter and with everyone. It says that Peter was in the courtyard, and they started a fire, and they were all gathered around this fire. And I was just kind of curious. I looked up on AccuWeather.com. The average low temperatures at night in Jerusalem in April are about 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, yeah, definitely cold enough to merit a fire. Let's read verses 56 through 60. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. I think Peter's denial of Jesus is one of the saddest stories in all of the Bible. And especially when you put yourself into Peter's position, and especially when you're in his mind thinking that Jesus isn't coming back, right? That Jesus is going to be killed. And from what we understand from the rest of the Gospels is Peter doesn't seem to have an expectation that the Lord's going to rise from the dead after he's killed. He hasn't put those pieces together yet. So in light of that, what Peter would have been experiencing this night, I think, would have been just completely tragic. And it's sad, too, just because of well, why don't we talk about it? Let's go through the notes. Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and Jesus had predicted that this would happen and that a rooster would crow when it happened. So Peter's first denial, he's in the courtyard, he's warming himself by the fire. This servant girl recognizes him, and she points out and very directly asks him, you're one of them, aren't you? And he denies it, and he says, "No, And the reason he would do that is because he probably thinks that he's going to get in trouble with Jesus if he's caught, if he's one of Jesus's inside men. Peter's second denial is a little bit later. Another person asked him if he was a disciple, and he said, "Man, I am not." And then the third denial is about an hour later. A third person recognizes Peter as a Galilean, maybe because of his dress or his accent. I'm not sure, but he insists that he must be a disciple, and Peter denies any kind of affiliation or knowledge of Jesus. And as the words were coming out of Peter's mouth, the rooster crowed, just as the Lord had prophesied. And I believe Luke is the only one who records this next detail in verse 61. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and he wept bitterly. We don't know exactly where Jesus was in relation to Peter, but or how far away they were, but they were within eyesight. And when this final word of denial exited Peter's mouth, providentially, Jesus looked at him. And I think it's implied that Peter was looking at Jesus and that their eyes met. And, it's hard to imagine the flow of emotions that must have just washed over Peter in this instant. I mean, he goes from being seized by fear that he's going to be caught and, potentially arrested, to the disappointment of having done the exact thing that Jesus told him about in the upper room, having denied the Lord. And then the guilt of denying a friend who had always been faithful to him. And then just the pure sadness of knowing that he had abandoned his friend in the hour of need and in the last moments of his life, and that the last interaction that he thought he was ever going to have with Jesus was Jesus looking at him, knowing that he had just denied him. Right? Can you imagine what you would feel like if you thought that was the last experience that you were ever going to have with your best friend? I think, I'd be interested, there's no way of knowing this, but I'd be interested in knowing what Jesus' eyes communicated to Peter when he looked at him. Was it sadness of what he had done? Was it compassion? Was it care or love for Peter? Or was it disappointment? Imagine that in that moment, Peter probably couldn't even recognize himself. I mean, he had gone from boldly professing his loyalty to Jesus at the Passover meal. He had drawn his sword when the enemy was in the garden. And now he was just like cowering in a courtyard, pretending that he had never met Jesus, not knowing if, he had just wasted the last 3 years of his life, not knowing what he was supposed to be doing, how he could help in any way, what he could contribute. He's just completely and utterly just lost and directionless, it seems. And it just says that he went out and he wept bitterly. And that's the last that we hear of him for a little while, at least. Verse 63 through 65. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. Jesus' trial was a sham. That seems like not even a strong enough word to truly describe it. But it quickly dissolved into just abuse. The Jewish leaders, they didn't have any intention whatsoever of ever giving Jesus a fair trial. They didn't care to establish fact from fiction. They just wanted Jesus dead. They were willing to tell whatever lies. They were willing to break whatever laws they had to in order to make that happen. And I don't have it in our study, but there's several studies that you can find probably online that talk about all of the abuses of justice that occurred during Jesus' trial. The Jews, they had a pretty sophisticated legal system and rules for what was supposed to happen, to give somebody a fair trial. And there's studies about, and it's remarkable just how many of those rules they broke during this kangaroo court of, that they put Jesus in. I think that's the right term. Just like a fake trial is what I'm trying to say. They blindfolded Jesus. They hit him. They taunted him by asking him who it was, asking him to guess or to prophesy who it was who had done it. And I was trying to put myself into the shoes of those people who were doing that. And one day on Judgment Day, Jesus is going to look at some guy and he's going to be like, it was you. It was you who hit me. And that, I guess, could be the most terrifying outpouring of God's wrath that happens. I don't know that we'll see it on Judgment Day, but that could be, a terrifying display of God's wrath, or it could be the most incredible moment and scene of God's grace. Because what if that man repented? What if that man was one of those on the day of Pentecost who says, yes, we killed the Lord, and it was a mistake, and now I need to be forgiven? I don't know if that happened or not. Maybe. I hope it did. And what's insane and incredible and beautiful is that Jesus would forgive that guy because Jesus practiced what he preached. And in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, Jesus taught about turning the other cheek. Somebody hits you on the cheek, turn the other one also, rather than take vengeance on him. Jesus turned the other cheek to give that man a chance to be saved. And really, figuratively, metaphorically, I suppose, that's true for all of us. But that man specifically has Jesus turned the other cheek, and boy, will he be thankful for it if he was one of those who later recognized his wrong. Jesus is pretty great, yeah? I think, the more you think about these things and dwell on them, it's just incredible. Application time. Let's take a moment here to admire Jesus' self-discipline in this situation. I know that when I'm mistreated or when I'm taken advantage of, it's easy for me to start justifying why I can take vengeance on somebody. It's like, well, if I don't teach them the lesson, they're going to do this to other people. Therefore, I'm actually taking more of an instructive role rather than a vengeful role in getting back at this person. We try all kinds of ways to justify getting vengeance on people, and it's hard, especially hard for me. But Jesus didn't do that. And that's it's especially difficult not to do it when you have the ability to do it. And Jesus certainly had the ability to do it. I mean, he could have whispered a word and just taken the life right out of any of those men who were abusing him. But he didn't. If anyone had the right to do that, if anyone had if anyone could justify it, Jesus could. And so the next time we try to justify our vengeance on someone, we need to remind ourselves of scenes like this one. Whenever revenge or vengeance swells up inside of us, we need to be reminded that Jesus didn't allow that to consume him and to control him. All right, the last section here. Verse 66 through 71. When day came, the assembly of the elders and the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated on the right hand of the power of God, at the right hand of the power of God." And so they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." And then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Verse 66 is important because it tells us that Jesus had spent the entire night in the custody of the Jews. Because it says when the day came. So he was arrested at night. He had spent all night in the abusive custody of these Jews. So this had been a long night, and he's now taken to the council. The council was known as the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was granted limited judicial power by the Romans. So they could pass some judgments, pass out some punishments, but not all. So, they'd have to take Jesus to this council to get their faux verdict against him to ultimately bring about what they want. So Jesus is put on trial, another fake trial, another fake examination. The other Gospels tell us that the Jews actually hired lying witnesses to come in and to testify against Jesus's, quote, crimes. And Jesus, though, he didn't respond to their accusations. I mean, it wasn't worth it. He knew he was wasting his breath. They weren't interested in finding out the truth. Caiaphas, though, the high priest, wasn't content with Jesus' silence, and he demanded an answer from him. He says, "If you are the Christ, tell us." In Matthew's account, he says, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Adjure means like to urge. I urge you by the living God. You think about just the hypocrisy of that statement. I mean, if any blasphemy was being uttered in that courtroom, it was to be found in the godless high priest who was evoking the name of God to undermine God. Like, how stupid is that? Now, Jesus he calls out Caiaphas' hypocrisy. He tells him that he wasn't worthy of receiving any answers because he wasn't interested in the truth. He wouldn't believe Jesus even if he told him, even if he presented evidence to him. And I mean, the reality was Jesus had been presenting evidence for the last 3 years. His miraculous signs, even in the last week of his life. I mean, all the things that he did were evidence. But oh no, the high priest, he wasn't interested in that. So even though he knew that Caiaphas wasn't going to listen, to bring about God's plan, Jesus went ahead and he did answer his question. He says, "I'm not going to tell you if I am the Christ, but here's what you need to know." He says, "From now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." Jesus had referred to himself as the Son of Man often during his ministry. And if I'm not mistaken, this statement is a reference back to a prophecy that's found in Daniel chapter 7, I believe verses 13 and 14, talking about how a son of man will be presented before the Ancient of Days. It's God. And God will give him dominion and power forever and over all nations. And so Jesus here is saying to Caiaphas that if you go about with your plan, what you're going to bring about, what you're going to see in the future is the Son of Man presented before God and sitting in glory. And basically what he's saying is, I am that Son of Man, and this is going to come to pass. Now, the Jews, knowing that verse back in Daniel chapter 7, they can connect the dots probably more easily than we can as first century modern readers. But they know exactly what Jesus is referencing here. And he didn't leave any room for misinterpretation. Jesus wasn't just a man. He was the Christ. He was the Son of God. He was divine. He would sit in dominion. Matthew tells us that Caiaphas tore his robes when he heard Jesus say this, because he understood it. And Caiaphas was putting on this big show of religious offense. He tore his garments as if he was just distraught over the disrespect that Jesus had just uttered. And in reality, Jesus' answer was exactly what he was hoping for. It was something that he could use to accuse Jesus. So Caiaphas wanted to use Jesus' claim to accuse him of blasphemy and to put him to death. Jesus knew in answering that way that he was playing into Caiaphas' plan. But what Caiaphas didn't know was that in putting Jesus to death, he was actually playing into God's ultimate plan for redeeming mankind. So Jesus and God, they're playing chess on another level here than Caiaphas. Caiaphas thinks that he's going to stop Jesus if he kills him. In reality, he is presenting the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days. Let's see. I think we already covered this. Oh yeah, this is the final point here. So Jesus claimed to be the Christ, and that was enough for them to accuse him of blasphemy. But you notice that there was never any evaluation of Jesus' claim. Like, they didn't actually lay out the evidence, the events of his life, his previous statements, the testimony of his miracles. There was no evaluation as to whether or not his life fit the qualifications of being the Messiah. They were just outraged by his claims because, it didn't fit their view. So they were offended by it because they didn't like it. If they had actually taken the time to do the evaluation, they would have realized that Jesus fit every qualification for the position that he was claiming. And I think there is a really important application from that, especially in our culture, and that is that outrage and offense are not good measures of truth. Just because something offends you or doesn't fit your worldview or your expectations or your imagination of the things or the way that things would work out, that doesn't make it right or wrong. Just because you're outraged or offended it's not a statement of truth. And we need to do, if we're going to actually figure out what is true and what is untrue, we need to lay out the evidence, examine the evidence, lay it out logically and rationally, and bounce it off of the Word of God and the things that God has said and the truths that we know about the world that he has created. And then and only then can something be established as true or false. And that might sound like common sense, but our world is doing a really good job at convincing people that if something is offensive, then it is immoral. If something is offensive, then it should be thrown out of society. And they're even doing a pretty good job at redefining God as a God who is loving and tolerant except against those who offend others, which is a horrible definition of God, because that is not in any way the way that in any sense, the way that he presents himself in his word. Just because something offends you means absolutely nothing in regards to whether or not that statement is actually true. If you think about it, things that are true, well, I don't think I want to say it like that, but I think I just want to drive home the point. We need to look at evidence, we need to look at facts, we need to look at rationality, or we need to look at them rationally and logically, and in light of God as the creator of the universe and what that means in our world and his moral law. We need to look at all of that stuff. And if something is consistent with rationality and logic and God's moral law and it's offensive to us, then we better change our view of things, because something is true whether or not it makes us angry or not. So just watch out for that. Especially, I feel like that's really permeating schools and young people, especially when parents aren't guiding their children in how to think morally, how to think in light of a creator and the principles that he's instilled into the universe, right? When you don't have a moral compass and a moral guide other than society will train you to think that everything that's offensive is wrong and that the greatest sin in the world is to offend people. But anyway, I'm getting off my soapbox. This video has been long enough. Just keep that in mind and present that whenever you have a chance. At the very end of this chapter, I've included a timeline, my best efforts to figure out a timeline of the last week of Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection, how that all fits into the Passover week and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Man, this timeline took me forever. It is not as easy as I thought it was to figure all this stuff out. But it's there in the back of the notes, and maybe we'll go through that a little bit more in the next couple videos. We've got 4 more videos to go, or podcasts, whatever you call these. And so not a whole lot of time, but I'm looking forward to finishing this up with you guys. And thanks everyone who's been listening. And remember, there are notes down in the description, and there's a study of the book of Acts coming up next. We are finally done with the Gospels. So I'm excited. I hope you are too. All right. Have a good day.